different than most literary talks. First, it's a nonfiction subject. Second, it's about current events, and that's pretty unusual for a talk. So I'm not going to talk a great deal about Chris's background and his biography because it's really part of the story. And this whole book is about a journey and revelations learned from his experiences. So I'm just going to turn it off to Chris. And of course, Chris, thank you for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, my pleasure.
So I'm just going to start by asking the kind of the first question. How did you get to the point of writing this book, and why?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Secondly, hi, Mom and Dad. And I appreciate you guys introducing me to this fantastic library, by the way. A couple housekeeping things. Number one is, I think my publisher, Post Hill Press, and Simon & Schuster are trying to figure out how the value of doing these kind of things, because this is new to everybody. So if I do perform relatively well and you haven't pre-ordered the book, I would love you to please do that. If I don't perform well, you don't have to. And I know some of you have already pre-ordered it, but it's really important because we're starting to look at how we're going to get out and promote the book away from just the television stuff I've been doing. And I love doing this kind of thing. The one-on-one is, or on a small group is super fun to do. Number two is we decided when I got a publisher, I asked contractually whether we could print the book in the United States of America rather than where most books are printed, which happens to be China. That was pre-COVID and everything else. That ended up being very smart, just purely from a supply chain issue. However, there's a lot of books trying to cut us in line. So the more pre-orders, the better. So please get out there and tell your friends about it if you find this interesting. Also, if anybody is using social media nowadays, I invite you to follow my Twitter, which I just started. And I'm actually doing all the content myself. I did not allow the publisher to hire somebody to do my content on there. So that's at the Dragon Feed, or at the Dragon Feeder is my Twitter, and then feeding.the.dragon is my Instagram. So feel free to follow. And then there's www.feedingthedragonbook.com, which can find any other information you want to find on this. Why did I write a book? Well, it goes back to, there's some Cornellians on here. When I was at Cornell myself, I graduated in 1993. I was a Fiji, like a couple of these other people on this Zoom. I actually saw a lecture from another Cornellian, Kurt Vonnegut. And, Kurt Vonnegut was obviously a very famous writer. And he talked about how he was a physics major and I was an engineering grad. And somebody asked him at the lecture, how did you become a writer? And he said, well, I became a writer because I was a physics major. And somebody said, that doesn't make sense. And he says, yes, it does, because I would write and I wouldn't know if it was any good. So I'd actually end up finishing what I was writing, versus every English teacher I knew would start writing, look at it, critique it to death, and then throw it away, and they never finished anything. So he's like, the fact that I didn't know I was any good at writing or not worked in my favor. So when I was a senior, I actually dabbled with trying to write something that ultimately sold as for movie rights. And then the movie never got made, but we'll have to see if we can resurrect that old manuscript at some time. So I knew at one point in my life, I found some sort of a voice The voice is pretty pedestrian. It's not an intellect type of voice. In a world where I would, it would be ideal to be compared to like a Michael Lewis or a Ben Mesrich. I looked at the experiences that I had in a way where I happened to fall into it simply because I was living life in a way where I would constantly look for opportunities, and one opened up and I ended up diving headfirst into it. And that was in the early days of capitalism between the US and China. But the way I write the book is as if anybody on this call or anybody that I talk to or any reader could have experienced the same thing themselves. Like, it just so happened it happened to me. I'm not a Bloviate think tank guy. I'm not a Asian PhD studies major. I come at it from a very practical and applied point of view, and that comes through in the voice in the book. Why did I write the book? Well, I always thought, as I was living through the 20 years of U.S.-China dynamics, that every time I was over there, some crazy anecdote would occur. I took copious notes of a lot of stuff that happened. There happened to be a lot of really amazing characters. There were fantastic antagonists and fantastic protagonists. And ultimately, what we were doing was just happened to be in the movie, sports, music, media business of marketing and advertising also. That microcosm happened to be a super loud, showcased centerpiece of capitalism between the two countries. It wasn't the pharmaceutical business. It wasn't the automobile business. It wasn't businesses that arguably create a lot more economic benefits for both countries. It just happened to be a very loud, high-profile business. Am I supposed to admit this person? I'm going to admit them. It was something that was very high-profile. It happened to be on the front page of lots of papers, and it also happened to be very, very paid attention to by both governments. So when I finished my run at the company that I was working with, this Chinese company that ultimately went public, a couple publishers did approach me about writing a how-to book, 10 lessons about doing business between the US and China. Things that were, I think, inside baseball for just people looking to do business between the two countries.
Oh, good.
Oh, who's that? Hey, Lori, you need to mute, please.
I had muted.
Ah. Well, you're so loud we can hear you over the mute. Anyway, joining us. The interesting thing is I had a couple publishers that said, hey, if you can write a memoir that is very approachable and engaging for a large audience, doesn't really necessarily care about China or care about the movie business or care about sports in particular, but just wants to read a really colorful journey, we're game to give it a shot. So that's what I, engaged in myself, trying to figure out how to do it. And what was interesting is that after the proposal and I made a commitment to the publishers that are doing the book, it actually took me about 5 weeks to write the book itself, which I couldn't believe. Although I didn't really sleep all that much, and that drove my wife crazy, but it was all in my head. I knew exactly what I wanted to do. What was interesting, and this is going to open up a lot of discussion, is for 15 years between 2000 and essentially 2014 is where the book ends. The colorful journey that I wrote about was about the beauty of cultural and commercial commerce and the exchange of that between the two superpowers and the power of it to create glue that binds them, right? I have an op-ed that was supposed to come out from the New York Times this weekend, but I don't know if anybody had been following, but the New York Times op-ed section has had some issues this week, so I'm finding a new home for it. presently. But that op-ed is essentially about 5 forces of diplomacy that keep the superpowers in communication, having some sort of diplomatic relationship together. The 5 are human rights agreements on human rights, politics, national security, commerce, and culture. My argument in the op-ed is that 3 of those forces we've never agreed with China and never will. And that's national security issues, politics, and human rights. So we need to give up even trying. But instead, let's focus on the 2 that do keep us bound, which are commerce and culture. And Hollywood, which if you look behind me, you have Chappaquiddick, you have a very not well done version of Point Break that we did. And then you have Iron Man 3 back there. Hollywood's at the forefront of cultural and commercial diplomacy between the 2 countries. Other types of companies or industries are obviously the sports industry. Nike was there very early, NBA, Michael Jordan, etc. So a lot of what I cover in the book is the magic of commerce and culture and that exchange between the 2 superpowers. What was interesting is that when I finished the book, I was planning on writing an afterword, which I ended up doing based on days I had on the ground with 3 congressional members last August, just before COVID broke out, actually. I took Congressman Alan Lowenthal, Congresswoman Dina Titus, and Congresswoman Ann Kirkpatrick to China for trade and investment discussions. And we did 12 days over there. And we happened to be allowed to go visit Hong Kong. And we met with protesters and also with Carrie Lam. And the night of our Carrie Lam lunch was the night that Donald Trump, it was daytime here in the U.S. He sent out a tweet saying, "I hereby order all businesses, American businesses, to pull their, resources out of China immediately." And the markets tanked. And that's what spurred a memoir entry into the afterword of the actual book. And that was essentially bringing what was a timeless sort of 15 years that I described in the book of the color of being in the middle of this capitalistic endeavor between the 2 countries in culture and commerce, and then bringing it into a timely nature where I could say in an afterword where the world and the state of affairs was between the 2 countries. And I did that. And then I handed it in to the publisher. And then a few weeks later, I'm at my son's soccer game, and I notice a tweet pop up that somebody sent me from a guy named Daryl Morey, who I had never heard of before, but he happened to be the Houston Rockets general manager. And I said to a father sitting next to me, I said, "Uh-oh, that's going to be a problem for the NBA in China." And he goes, "Why is that?" "It's just a tweet from some GM you never heard of." And I said, "Well, it's a tweet from the number 1 team in China, the Houston Rockets, thanks to Yao Ming, who brought that team into the largest branded team in that country. And they are the centerpiece of the NBA." And I was 100% right. It crushed the NBA's business in China. But what I didn't predict, and this is what I'm getting to, I know it's long-winded, but trying to walk you through it, is the wokeness that occurred in the United States of America by a much larger group of the general public and also government officials about the pandering that U.S. businesses were doing with the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, to get their products and services into that market, get access to it. So it made me look back at everything I'd written, and I started to work on another afterword that added to how I kept it timely. And it was essentially how I realized I was extremely complicit in what people had problems with in regards to American businesses. And I walk through people that process. And I actually walked through the arguments I had with various individuals, like for instance, Kevin Feige, who ran Marvel at the time, when I was trying to get him to put more China relevancy into Iron Man 3, when I was trying to get more actors from China in the film, when I was arguing about why are we cutting China footage from the film. And he would say, but that's not making the movie better. That's not being fair to our fan base. That's not being true brand stewards of Marvel, blah, 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 blah. Which when I look back at, I go, wow, he wasn't the antagonist, I was. And I was trying to get him to compromise what his job is running that company. And I commend him on being the way we need to look at China moving forward, which is we need to be true as Americans. We can't compromise on national security interests or principles or things that make us inherently Americans, the things that make our businesses and products and services really important and valuable worldwide. We need to be careful of that. And as a nation, we need to guard and protect companies that are doing business in China, so there aren't retaliatory efforts done by the CCP against companies that do things that they're not happy with, that are trying to get in that market and are trying to grow in that market. So that ends what I thought was the final part of the book. And then ultimately, there's a postscript in the book, which tackles the fact that Kobe Bryant was in the book quite a bit. So I had to address his unfortunate passing. And then also I had to bring it into an op-ed I had written that was published right around week 3 of the COVID crisis, and sort of my thoughts there. So in summary, why did I write the book? 2 reasons. One is I wanted people to understand, well, first of all, I wanted to entertain people. It's an engaging book. It's colorful. It's a really fun story. It's sort of outlandish, some of the things that happen. And quite frankly, I pulled back a lot of the stories mainly because I thought they just weren't believable. So it's very entertaining. I hope people get engaged by it, even if they don't care about China or any of the stuff that is around it. They just want a fun story. But I wanted people to understand that there's a fog of war that occurs when you're just driven to get business done, to get stuff accomplished, and to make things happen that haven't been done before, right? That was important to me, was to express that, you know what, I wasn't a bad guy. I wasn't, trying to do things malicious for companies because I just wanted to make money and I was greedy and all that stuff. It was more about, we had a mission, we had a purpose, we knew what we wanted to do, we knew what we had to do to execute it, and this is the story, right? And then I wanted to tackle the timely part of it, the current part, which is that's what was going on back then. That's what's gotten us to this point. And then what are we going to do moving forward in the future? Because I don't want a Cold War with China, nor do any of us. And there's a lot of great promise and opportunity in that market. So we should take advantage of it. But we need to know what the challenges are, and we need to know what we need to address as a country together. So the book has a mission and purpose that's bigger than just entertaining. And then it also has the mission and purpose of hopefully engaging a reader in a really fun story.
So Chris, what is it about China that makes it so important and so different than just dealing with other foreign countries?
Well, part of the book, I bring us into the present day by covering the history of the U.S.-China relationship starting back actually in 1790. And one part of the preamble into my story is the fact that we did have essentially a Cold War. It wasn't really a Cold War. We just had frozen relationship between the U.S. and China starting roughly around the end of the Korean Peninsula War and into what I see as sort of the catalyst to starting everything. And a lot of people would agree, although there were other things that were going on at the time. But that ping pong diplomacy moment, which was really interesting because culture, the sports culture, And the spirit of competition created a pathway for Kissinger and Nixon to show up in February 1972 for the first time and actually engage in the idea of, wow, maybe the two of us can actually do something together. Before Kissinger and Nixon got there, we had no relationship whatsoever with China. But that was doable then because China had many internal issues. They were looking inwards, trying to figure out how are they going to keep 800, 900 million people just happy enough that they don't revolt. They had food issues. They weren't spreading their wings. They were essentially a sleeping giant. Cut to today, they're a dragon expanding and spreading their wings and looking to be a major player on the global stage. I would argue, I don't necessarily believe they want to be the number one power in the world. I think a lot of people would disagree with that, but I do think they want to be the number one power on their side of the world and allow us to be the number one power on this side of the world. That's to be debated. I'm starting to get a little more hawkish than I used to be. But the bottom line is the reason why we have to take China so seriously, way more than any other country. You're asking why other countries aren't seen in the same way, at least for me, is that China is going to be the number one economy in the world, not because the US isn't worthy of maintaining that status, but just simply they got 1.4 billion people there. So sheer momentum is going to allow them to become the largest economy in the world. They're a nuclear power. They have a much larger military than they did a decade ago. And they're very interested in expanding their influence around the world. So the idea of starting any sort of a Cold War with them, like we had post-Korean Peninsula War, is a terrible idea because we need to figure out how to keep them somewhat in check and somewhat in the realm of making the world a more peaceful and prosperous place for everyone. And part of that's going to be continued communication and some sort of relationship. I mean, there's been various leaders that have called it strategic competitors. Like maybe that is the semblance of being that the two countries should be, but we need to have some sort of relationship. We can't move into a Cold War, and that's where culture and commerce is so important. And that's arguably why, the higher purpose of why I wrote this book.
Do you have a perspective on why the United States let all our great paying jobs, manufacturing jobs, go overseas, principally to China at the time?
Well, the op-ed that I wrote for the Times talks about that in abstract because I look at it like globalism, which, by the way, I was a massive believer in. I mean, to get anything done between the U.S. and China was a grind. It was very difficult. And I believed strongly in everything that we could get done between those two countries was in the best interest of what we did. And part of that was helping China develop their own film industry, right? If you look at China in the most simplistic way, which is very important for us as Americans, because China is really like an onion where you can continually peel back more parts, peels, and it just gets more complicated. So I always look at how to address anything in China as the most macro issue that I can think of that the CCP cares about. And that's keeping 1.4 billion people just happy enough that they don't revolt. And why don't they make them all happy? Well, because there's not enough resources on earth to make them all happy. So how do you keep them just happy enough that they don't revolt and repeat another June 4th, 1989? Is you provide them all that they need and a little of what they want. And that's tangible, right? So you got to create middle-class jobs. You got to create some sort of prosperity, opportunity, allow them to build their per capita income so they can actually achieve that tangible stuff. But then also, just as importantly, you need to create a narrative that makes them think they have all of what they need and some of what they want. And that's what China's so good at, right? Is creating one narrative, one party line that's disseminated through the whole country. And if everybody, imagine if CNBC or CNN and MSNBC and Fox News and, Dennis Prager and Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh and Rachel Maddow and Bill Maher, all of them had the exact same message they were telling all of us all the time. Imagine how powerful that would be, right? Everybody would feel and believe in that same narrative all across America. Well, that's what happens in China, right? And part of what they need to do is always make sure that they look like they're providing as leadership everything that the Chinese need and some of what they want. So if you look at that in terms of business, right? When I look at the pandering aspect of what I was doing, a lot of it had to do with how do you get, let's go with a movie, for instance, like Looper, which I can, let's see,
We just
I'm
lost.
in my screening room right now.
Oh,
There's the Looper. Oh, lost me. I was trying to show. Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. I was just showing a Looper poster. So there's a movie Looper that we did. And it's a sci-fi thriller that takes place in the future. China, because they control narrative, doesn't like time travel in a movie. Why don't they like time travel? Because they like to make sure that they can control the narrative of something that happened in the past and something that's going to happen in the future. So if somebody creates a form of content that differs from the way they like to tell past history or the way they're talking about what China's going to be in the future, they won't let it into the market. So we said, well, what if we make this movie about China being the important aspect of the future in this film? Because originally the script was France. The main character wanted to move to France 40 years in the future because France was an amazing place and it had beautiful women and great food and this amazing civilization 40 years in the future. Well, we convinced the filmmakers to change it to China. And the way we got Chinese authorities on board with the movie is we allowed them access to the script so that they could dictate how Shanghai was going to look in the future. In fact, we designed buildings with the Shanghai municipal government that they thought would be buildings that they would be proud of 40 years in the future, and buildings that they could showcase through the movie saying, look at how amazing this country is going to be 40 years from now. Like, look at the skyline of Shanghai. On top of that, we had Bruce Willis, who's in the movie. He was married to a French woman in this script, but we changed his wife to a Chinese actress named Summer Ching. And China was very adamant that everything that we shot in China would be in the global cut of the movie so that Summer Ching and all of her non-edited parts of the movie would be in there. And in fact, they were adamant to make sure she was on the movie poster globally too. And they wanted the skyline in the future showcased around the world. Well, the filmmaker, Rian Johnson, who now directs Star Wars movies, was like, hey, some of this China stuff just doesn't make the movie any better. We got to cut some of it out. So we had a lot of arguments and disagreements about, well, no, you can't cut that out. You can't cut that out. No, you got to keep that in there. No, the government's not going to allow us to release the movie if we do this and that and whatever. And ultimately, we tried something that had never been tried before. And we decided to make 2 cuts of the film. Like, you hear about censored parts of American movies in China where they take out certain pieces of a film. But this was the first time where we actually said, hey, you know what? For China, we're going to extend all the China scenes by 7 minutes and show them all this great footage that we took. That doesn't necessarily make the movie better, but showcases China and makes the government happy there. But then for the rest of the world, we're going to actually not have that stuff in there and focus on making the best movie possible. Well, the Chinese authorities found out about that plan and almost shut the movie down. Ultimately, we won a bunch of battles on it, and we also agreed to put Summer Chang, who was a very small role in the movie. We put her on the global one sheet of the film, which is the movie poster you'd see all over the place. We put her in there with Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Bruce Willis, even though she was barely in the film, mainly because we had to placate their mandate that they wanted to showcase China throughout the world. So if you look at sort of the issues that we're dealing with now in regards to China and sort of the way that they're causing us to press their soft power around the world, that's one of the things that we need to start to address a bit. Did I answer your question there? Because I'm going to bring in a couple of anecdotes too to make sure that this is all tangible.
Well, it's the question of, when we think of China, we think of basically groupthink. And groupthink is that you can only think one way. And in the United States, of course, we are the complete opposite. We can't even get ourselves to think or agree sometimes on the same subject. So we have two very different personalities and styles. And yet we're going to be adversaries for quite a while. And it's going to be interesting to see how we deal with their desire to control thought with a country that finds it appalling to control somebody's thought. We're so individualist. It's a place that so is almost too individualist.
Well, I think a livable compromise, I think, that can occur is that we decide, look, if anybody's been watching, Senator Ted Cruz brought a bill to the Senate about prohibiting any sort of federal assets to be used by Hollywood in the event Hollywood is trying to self-censor itself in order to get access to the China market. And one of the examples he uses is the new version of Top Gun, which Paramount's releasing shortly, where Tom Cruise is wearing a jacket that had the Japanese and Taiwanese flag on it. And China said, no, you got to remove those flags from the jacket. Okay, that's a pretty terrible demand if you think about it. But Paramount did it. Why? Because China's going to be possibly the largest market in the world for the movie, or maybe the second largest. My compromise idea, which I think is doable, is within their own market, they can censor things however they want, like they always have. And by the way, the Middle Eastern markets do it. Korea does it. Japan does it. Everybody has different things that they don't like in Western culture that they cut out, whether it's cuss words or nudity or sexual innuendo, whatever it is, okay? Inside your market, you can do whatever you want. But outside, you have no jurisdiction. So you can blur out those two flags on Tom Cruise's jacket, but if the filmmakers in the studio want to have those on there for the rest of the world to see, they can. Now, the issue with that is you might find China retaliate because of that, which is, by the way, what Daryl Morey sort of did, right? He tweeted out his support for Hong Kong from his office in Dallas, Texas, or Houston, Texas. He wasn't on their soil. He did it here. He had every right to do that. But China penalized the NBA by taking them off the air and cutting all ties to marketing and all other kinds of stuff. So they lost hundreds of millions of dollars in the process. The United States government, that's where they have to step in. They have to say, hey, look, we as a nation are not going to put up with that. We can't let sacrificial lambs like the NBA just, oh, well, that's their battle. Too bad. Bummer that Daryl Morey did that, but good thing Daryl Morey stood up for the protesters, right? And by the way, LeBron James, why don't you stand up for the protesters too? Well, what good is that if as a nation we're not going to back these companies and back these individuals so that they don't have any sort of retaliation done to them in a market that's paying them lots of money, right? I mean, we're either as a nation against China and all for Hong Kong, and unless Hong Kong is completely free, we're going to stop doing business with China, which, by the way, is never going to happen. There's too much money there. Like the stock markets would fall to zero if we did that, right? So we're going to still do business with China because we have to, right? But we should also focus on the Hong Kong protesters and what's right for them, and for Taiwan, and allow the flag on, because we believe in Taiwan being a separate, country in a lot of respects, although we have some hypocritical sort of issues with the way we look at them too. But as a nation, we have leverage, and we can back these companies and force China not to retaliate because Paramount decides to keep these flags on the jacket of Tom Cruise. We could have done the same thing with the NBA, but we didn't. And if we don't support these individual companies and the individual industries and all the industries together as a nation, using the leverage of the nation, because China needs us, then every time this occurs, we're either going to call people out and say, why didn't you say something about that? Or they are going to do something and we're going to call them panderers, one of the two. And in either situation, they're just fighting their own battle that they're going to lose either side on, with the rest of us just sort of sitting there and getting on our soapbox and saying, hey, why didn't you do this or that? So that's my point is I think as a nation, we can say, hey, look, with the Ted Cruz legislation, we get it, but you're not going to be able to tell the CCP how to create their narrative for their people. Like, they're going to do that, and we're never going to win that battle. So let's give up on that. But let's stick hard as a country and defend our rights outside of their border. That's the key.
So you said something that's very interesting. Why does China need us?
Well, we're their largest consumer, right? And then if you look at the supply chain, a lot of our companies have moved our supply chain into China. So they're beholden to the companies that are using them as the factory powerhouse that they are. On top of it, they are beholden to the US dollar. They obviously hold a lot of our debt. So they sort of want to make sure that we're a good borrower. And then there's a lot of, the economic reasons are massive, right? And then on top of it, they are trying to spread their wings around the world. And if the United States, I get the fact that we're not the most liked country right now, but typically if we're leaders in the world, the way we look at China is very important for the way people interact with China. And China needs people around different nations around the world to support what their objectives are. The Belt and Road Initiative, which is allowing them to spread all over the world. If the US suddenly said, hey, Nigeria, shut down access to that port that they're building for you, or Madagascar, no, you can't let them fish off your coast, or whatever it is, I think we still have that ability to leverage some of those countries into taking our side versus theirs. I think we're starting to lose some of that leverage, but for the moment we have that. So China needs to play nice with us as much as they can. We're not making it easy for them, nor should we, but they need us and we need them.
How big a deal is the intellectual property on their side, on the Chinese side?
You mean how
But, you know, one of the big arguments and contentions with the United States and China is ownership of intellectual property, copyrights, stuff like that.
Well, intellectual property is protected if businesses are playing ball the way the CCP is expecting them to. I mean, one of the great sort of misguided thoughts out there is, like, if you look at the movie business, a lot of executives think, oh, we just want our movies to clear censorship and to get into that market. But that's not actually what you want. What you want is the ability to monetize that movie or that television series, right? Because almost everything gets into that market, but it's pirated, or it's on the, you know, black market side, or it's actually distributed somehow through a state-owned enterprise that's actually not paying the people who made the content, right? So the goal is to get the CCP to say, you're approved, we're going to make sure that this content is monetized, and we're going to protect that right of the US company so that they can properly monetize it and get money back for what is being consumed in our country. That's what you need. So intellectual property is the same way. Protection of IP is done if the CCP feels that whatever company that owns that IP is playing ball the right way. So if you look at a company like GM, GM, to get in there and sell Buicks, which, by the way, Buicks, I can't remember the last time I've seen a Buick drive around in the US, but there, Buicks are a luxury item. The consumers love Buicks. But how did Buicks get in there? How did GM get in there? Well, GM decided they wanted in. And the CCP said, well, if you want access, then you need to come in and you need to be co-owned by a Chinese company or a Chinese entity, and they need to own 51% of everything that you do. And in exchange for that, we'll protect your IP and your patents and your technology and allow you to monetize and market and reach the consumers of China. And GM signed off on that deal. One of the problems is that, yes, that stuff is protected, but it's not quite as protected. It's protected from the masses of stealing it, but there's also various entities within that JV that tend to steal some of that technology, and then they go and make it under Chinese companies. And you notice cars that are like, oh, wow, I've never seen that Buick before. Oh, no, that's not a Buick. That's a Buick or something. You know, it's the Chinese version of a Buick. So the protection of IP and technology is done to an extent, although over time we're starting to see, and monetizing that IP and patent is allowed over a certain amount of time. But eventually we start to notice that even those protected IPs or technologies tend to get taken by another entity and put under a Chinese brand. And that's something, oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Rick? Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me.
We hear you.
Rick, you're on mute. I see, Rick. Okay. So, I mean, there's a great story about, just as an example, there was a high-speed rail bidding that was put on by China to see what international companies could come in and create new the maglev train system over there. And I think 7 companies went and competed for it. And they all had to build prototype tracks. And they were built somewhere on the outskirts of Shanghai. Well, I think it was Siemens. I got to look it up, but I think it was Siemens was one of the companies, and a bunch of their execs happened to be in town. And they're like, "Hey, let's go out to the track and check out what was built. We just got in. We all have jet lag or whatever." So they drive out there. It's like 2 a.m. and they notice these tents built over it. And they walk in, and there's all these Chinese engineers like looking at everything in there under these tents. And obviously that's been curtailed a bit over time, but it is something that we got to keep a serious eye out for. And whether it's, you know, the WTO or the leverage of the United States if things don't happen in the future, I don't know what the answer is. Stace, you hear me now? Can you guys hear me? Okay. Anyway, I think did I finish that? Rick, take off.
Yeah, I think you finished that.
I noticed August Miller said, has a chat on here, if when economic growth slows in China, do you think demands for more democratic overtures will increase? That's a pretty good question. First of all, economic growth is slowing in China, as we know. I mean, the COVID crisis obviously is a whole nother story, but it was slowing. I have seen the power of the Ministry of Propaganda work its magic with narrative. I think it will take a really long spell of economic malaise to get the Chinese population rearing towards some sort of June 4, 1989 scenario again, where they're demanding democratic overtures. Like I was there during some slow times in 2012 where they just decided, hey, what's the easiest way to get out of this? I don't know if you remember 2012, you had a Uyghur contingency that drove trucks through Tiananmen Square and killed a bunch of people. You had these railroad stabbing incidents which were mass killings. There was a lot of unrest. And what did China do? They didn't get, the CCP didn't get scared about more demands for democratic overtures. They just said, okay, well, what switch do we flick on in the narrative to change the narrative? And what they decided to do was send a bunch of ships to some rocky islands that Japan islands of their own. Let's see, you good? Can you hear me?
You need to back up like 2 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to put this
Or a minute.
Okay, is that better, by the way?
No, it's about the same.
Okay, well,
That's better.
there was
Closer.
Rick, where did I lose you, by the way? Did I get into Japan?
Yeah.
Okay, so because August asked about the economic growth slows, do we see the demands for democratic overtures increasing? I was going back to 2012, where there were issues with the Uyghur minority showing unrest. They were driving vans through Tiananmen Square. There was a mass killing there. There were train stations with mass killings through stabbings and et cetera. The CCP didn't blink an eye. They didn't go, oh my God, we're going to have a June 4, 1989 scenario again. Instead, they just go, well, what lever do we turn on to change the narrative? What they decided to do was to go after these rocky islands that Japan and China have had a dispute over for a long time. And that caused a rise around the flag narrative and a lot of nationalism, which then caused issues like you would see Japanese auto dealerships that were lit on fire. You saw cars turned over that were Japanese made. There were Molotov cocktails thrown at the Japanese consulate. And suddenly everybody forgot about the discontent of the populace and they started rallying around the flag and being anti-Japanese, right? That's one switch that they do. And in fact, they've been doing it great during our US-China problems right now. This COVID thing has been an information war. Lots of different propaganda flying out there. Where did the virus start? Who was better leading their countries out of it? Who are the bad people in the U.S. spouting U.S. propaganda. Oh, look at you guys. You have riots and protests. Look at how like nice our society is. Look at Hong Kong. It's quieted down. So there's all this different narrative that it constantly occurs that keeps people away from thinking of democratic overtures, to answer the question, and more about, wow, we have great leaders. I love this country, and the people that aren't Chinese, I don't like.
Well, just to switch gears a little bit. It is, you know, you've been doing mostly interviews on conservative TV, and it from what I read and watch and listen, most liberals don't even think much about China, and that's a curious subject. Why do liberals just think China is just over there somewhere, I guess? What's the difference between the conservatives and the liberals on their approach to China, if you have a perspective?
Well, I have a great perspective on it. I don't talk about it on television, or I'm not very vocal about it, but I happen to be a registered Democrat. I'm a country first voter. I can vote either side of the aisle depending on who I think is best for the job. So I'm not very partisan in the way I think. This US-China issue is a nonpartisan issue for me. Like, we can't accomplish anything in regards to resetting the relationship unless both sides of the aisle are involved. It just has to be the country as a whole figuring out how to tackle this thing. So I'm trying to stay as nonpartisan as possible. The right now tends to be very hawkish towards China, and they tend to be, the right seems to be the only side of the aisle that is talking about China. You're 100% right on that. What's interesting to me and a bit ironic is, where is the left in this? Because if you look at what the left is supposed to be standing for, one is obviously human rights issues, the freedom of speech, and anti censorship. National security is obviously something both sides are in agreement on, but obviously the right is more focused on it. But then also labor. The Democratic Party used to be the pro-labor party, right? And the amount of manufacturing that we moved overseas, in particular to China, the supply chain issues that have obviously come to light drastically during the COVID crisis, these have all shed light on the fact that the gutting of the middle class, in a large part, has been because of this globalist agenda we've had, where moving manufacturing offshore, in particular to China, has been a huge part of the agenda. And where's the Democratic Party in regards to saying, oh my God, labor, people, middle class, we're behind you. We realize we've made some problems here over the years. Like, we're going to bring back these jobs. Now, granted, some of them aren't all that practical. I mean, do we really need to bring back T-shirt factories, et cetera? Probably not. Those aren't necessarily middle-class jobs. But there's a lot of heavy-duty technology and supply chain, pharmaceutical, different things that we have offshored that could be great job bases for us here in the US. And then also create this dependency on supply chain problem, which is a national security issue, to go away too. So the Democrats should be on this subject. And I do think, whether they want to be a part of it or not, they're going to get pulled into it. Trump is definitely going to paint Biden as a Xi Jinping best buddy who's spent a lot of time one-on-one. I think what's the 25 hours of one-on-one meetings, and he's the guy that's responsible for globalism, that sent all your jobs over there, and Biden's the bad guy. I'm the one that wants to stand up against China, right? So that China bashing is going to come into play from now, and it's just going to accelerate and get worse as November approaches.
So, we didn't talk about this previously, but their largest neighbor India. How, you know, uh, from your perspective, how well are they getting along these days?
Well, actually, I tweeted somebody in India, a friend of mine sent um, a news segment that popped up overnight where there is actually a conversation happening between one of the top generals in India and a top general in China, happening at that border disputed area, which I think is at like 16,000 feet in elevation. But it's supposed to occur sometime in the next 24 or 48 hours. So that's hopefully a good sign. There's so much to follow with China that I haven't been very focused on that particular dispute. But it does seem to start, it had been getting some momentum, and I was actually very relieved to see that that was, at least some conversation was occurring in the next couple of days.
Well, we've been at this for almost an hour. Does anybody have any other questions? Or
Yeah, it looks like Robin, is it Rabin?
Raven.
Raven.
Could you say words about the status of the Trump's trade war and how it's impacted American companies who are trying to do business there, and also about the Chinese attitude towards the conflict? Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So I got pulled into I'm advising the China Task Force, which is a newly put together committee in Congress by mainly GOP reps. So that's one of the questions that's been coming up in regards to, is the phase one deal even intact, and what should we be pushing the executive branch to be asking for with phase two if there is any further negotiations possible. I think there's a lot of over whether phase one is even being adhered to right now. In fact, a lot of the statistics are showing it's not. And most experts that are more expert than I am are saying that phase one is probably going to be dissolved, and Trump is going to have to figure out a new approach in regards to either bringing that back or taking a hard line stand, or, figuring out exactly how he wants to play that next move. How companies are dealing with it right now. Well, if you're watching the stock markets, obviously there's a lot of stimulus in the markets right now. There's a lot of COVID narrative in the markets, but I think what's interesting is that the markets aren't moving on all this crazy, U.S.-China dispute narrative that pops up, 2 or 3 times during the day. If you go back to last summer, anytime there was some sort of barking on one side or the other, the markets would move several hundred points. We're not seeing that right now. So I think a lot of companies and investors are looking at it as there's just a lot of banter and a lot of negative rhetoric, but there's nothing of substance occurring. I would agree that seems to be the case. I think on top of it, the score, I wrote an op-ed a couple of weeks ago about our scorecard being stock markets, which I think as long as that's the scorecard of how healthy we are as a country, I don't really see us being able to take a stand against China, because if we actually do something of substance to try to reset the relationship, earnings are going to get hurt drastically. It's going to cost a lot of money to take supply chains back to the US. I mean, that's going to be a very cost intensive, resource heavy, capital heavy, earnings depreciating sort of couple years. So it doesn't look like the markets are really bothered by that actually ever happening, at least right now. On top of it, I think individual companies are trying to just stay the course. There's a lot of noise out there. Let's just keep getting business done. And whether that's the right approach or not, I don't know. But I would say there does seem to be a lot more bluster than bite. Now, the place that I think is going to be an issue is Hong Kong. When we were there in August, we met with the American Chamber of Commerce there. Our companies, US companies at the time, were being threatened to answer the question of whose side are you on, Hong Kong protesters or Beijing? And obviously companies were delaying answering that question. And they were asking the United States government to deflect that question off of them and make it a national issue. Ultimately, that died off a little bit with the protests. But now that Beijing has looked at Hong Kong and said, hey, we have an opportunity to sort of push our initiative there, and it doesn't really look like America is going to do much about it, so the rest of the world isn't. Let's do it. Well, they're doing it. And yes, Donald Trump came out and made a statement about it, but I think Beijing is feeling like there was nothing of substance in that. So they're going to keep pushing that. So if they keep pushing that, what does happen with the major economic interests that we have in Hong Kong, particularly in the financial side of things, but there's a massive trade issue there and all kinds of other things. That's going to be a real question for US companies and also international companies, a lot of European companies. Do they stay in Hong Kong? Do they move to Singapore? Obviously, Singapore is opening their arms and saying, come to us. But if that happens, that's going to be a major disruption that is going to affect markets and economics globally at some level. Hong Kong obviously isn't a huge.
What about
Yeah.
what about the Great Britain's offer to take in 3 million Hong Kongers? That's an interesting gambit.
Yeah, it's well, and what's interesting, if you look at the expat or the passport holders of non-Hong Kong citizens, it tends to be, I think Canada and Japan are the two biggest, and then US is in there, and then obviously Europe. But it is going to be an interesting one. I think the one that I'm most worried about is actually Taiwan. President Tsai and the Taiwanese government has extended their hand saying, hey, come to us. It's a great gesture. I support the thought behind that. But boy, if you want to piss off Beijing, that's a great way to do it. And they're already thinking about how they want to handle Taiwan. And quite frankly, if they do decide to take back Taiwan, if Hong Kong is an example of how America is really going to play it, you would imagine Beijing sort of looking at that as the canary in the coal mine and going, well, maybe this is the time to go after Taiwan too. I don't know, but it's going to be very interesting. Another flare up that I know about from a board call I had yesterday in DC with the US Asia Institute is that Japan and Korea are having big issues between each other, and China's trying to flare that even more because China's seeing this opportunity that the more they can create bifurcation between different nations and break up alliances, the better for them in regards to pushing initiatives forward. Because obviously together, all of us have a lot of leverage. But if everybody's acting on singular interests as countries, it's going to be very difficult to contain China.
Hey,
Are there
Chris,
other questions? Yeah.
Yeah. You know, a lot of this stuff goes back to the issues in the 50s and the 60s. Not so much Hong Kong, but Taiwan versus mainland China, Chiang Kai-shek versus Mao Zedong. Are we in a similar position now that we were in with those conflicts in the 50s and 60s?
That question's probably a little over my pay grade. I don't know the history well enough to be able to sort of relate it to that period in time. All I can say is that we definitely have an issue that Taiwan is presenting right now, where they're getting more strong-willed against mainland China. Mainland China is telling them, stop, you need to pull it back a little bit. You got Hong Kong, that conflict going on, and then you have Taiwan reaching out to Hong Kong and saying, come with us. And then at the same time, the US is creating lots of waves by recognizing Taiwan in a much different way. I think that started, about a year and a half ago than they did up until then, like a much stronger sort of stance to protect Taiwan. And then we've been selling them a lot of arms, so it's a tinderbox, put it that way. And you probably know better than me exactly what was going on in the 50s and 60s. But if that was the case, I would say there's a lot of similarities.
Yeah, I can give you a little bit background because my family was from China, and of course during the World War II, Japan was in China, and at that time, Chinese Kuomintang was the main party in mainland China. Unfortunately, the Communist Party was in the inland area, was getting support from Russia. So they start to increase the power in the late 40s. And that's the time my parents decided to move to Taiwan. So all the people at that time under Kuomintang, we all moved to Taiwan. Some of people stayed. And of course, communists become so strong, they take over the whole mainland China. So when people ask me, are you Chinese, are you Taiwan or Hong Kong? The relationship is we are Chinese, but we were pushed back to Taiwan. Taiwan, 50 years prior to 1949, belonged to China. They lost it during the Opium War when the British people like to get the Chinese tea. At that time, China basically using gold at that time in the 1849, something like that. And then from the Opium War, that the British was basically was paying by gold, and then China, they said, well, let's exchange. We like your tea, but we don't want to pay gold continuously. Anything we can change. China at that time, this is in the late 1849, so we really don't need anything. So what the British, they started shipping the opium to China. And then Chinese did the same thing. They dump all the opium in the water, and then they become Opium War. At that time was still under Qing dynasty. Obviously, they are not very good in fighting. So they lost the war. That's the time they lost Hong Kong. So it was 99 years, Hong Kong become a part of British. So they all know by 1997 was exactly 99 years, they returned to China. So people in Hong Kong, of course, they have been so used to this freedom, and that's why there's so much conflict. So Hong Kong is a part of China. They have, after they return, they said they're going to have a one country, two systems. Yeah. So they have 50 years of the system. And that's why
what's interesting. I was just gonna, so you bring up the Hong Kong side of things. So when we were there in August, it was like if everybody has what they need and some of what they want, for the most part, they tend to be pretty happy with the governments that are overseeing them. And Hong Kong's not an exception to that. The Hong Kong, when we met with protesters, it was clear that independence and democracy for Hong Kong was not their demand. The demand was coming from lots of frustration from the younger generation. That young generation was seeing the encroachment of China since 1997 when the takeover started.
Yeah,
when occurred. They were seeing things like high-speed rail coming into Hong Kong. And that railway station actually had an area where technically if you walked across that fence inside the train station, inside the Hong Kong territory.
Oh, I cannot hear you.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were actually technically, oh, can you hear me? Hello?
On and off.
So how about now?
Yes.
Sure.
I think my son is doing a Zoom lacrosse practice on the wrong internet. That might be my issue. But what I was saying is the encroachment of mainland China into Hong Kong was really the biggest frustration occurring that was causing a lot of the protests. There was obviously the extradition law that catalyzed everything, right? And said, well, wait a minute, that makes us suddenly beholden to the laws in Beijing. But what was really a big issue is that the opportunities for the youth there were decreasing. Hello? Yeah, are we good? Hello? Okay, so massively decreasing real estate, for instance, super expensive for the young generation to buy into it or even rent. Education, very, very difficult for kids who typically would go to the best Hong Kong schools that were primary and then secondary. They couldn't get into because the mainland Chinese kids were now starting to attend those. A lot of the real estate problems were because mainland Chinese were coming down and buying up real estate that was typically designated for Hong Kong people. Then you had territory movements where you had the train station issue, which was pure physical encroachment of mainland China into the Hong Kong sovereign sort of area. Then you had the massive immigration of Chinese workforce coming in from the greater Bay Area through the high-speed rail and taking jobs from Hong Kong kids for 30 or 40% lower wages because they were living in the PRC, yet were coming in and doing the same exact job. And they were doing it with 150% more, determination and effort too, because this was the first generation where they got to have those kind of jobs. So the Hong Kong youth was very frustrated. And that extradition bill caused a tinderbox to be lit, which led to all the protests. But it was never about, we want freedom, right? That wasn't the argument. But now, obviously, it's quieted down, and we're starting to see China do exactly what people were fearing. And whether there's retaliation for that, I don't know. It's, time is going to tell here, but it doesn't seem like it.
Yeah. And Taiwan is similar because Taiwan has just changed the party. So it's not controlled under Kuomintang, and this party, they wanted to have independent. So there is a little bit of political issue over there.
Right. So are there any other questions here? I don't want to hold everybody up. I'm happy to answer anything. Mom.
Hey, Chris?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so do you see the Chinese youth, mainland China, the young adult? When we were there, they loved everything American. I mean, I sent you that photo the other day to remind you. Do they still love everything American? Is that still a piece?
Well, the American products and services tend to be considered. Yeah, they tend to be considered high quality, best in class. So yes, there's an aspirational consumer excitement around our stuff, but is there anti-American sentiment right now? Yes, there is. And is it seeping into the business that various industries from the US are trying to grow there? 100%. I think we're definitely going to see sales. I mean, it's hard now with COVID and all that stuff to actually see exactly why it's happening, but there is an anti-American sentiment going on that is fed into consumers there that is going to affect how much growth anything from, a Disney to a GM is going to have. Now, some companies, like for instance, Nike and Marvel, by the way, have positioned themselves more as global companies rather than US companies. So they might be able to escape some of that. It'll be interesting to see, but global brands tend to survive this better than US brands. And US brands survived it better when there was the anti-Japanese sentiment, in 2012. And then a couple years later, there was an anti-Korean sentiment because of the missile exchange that was going on the Korean Peninsula. where Korean products and services were losing lots of ground. Any other questions out there?
Yeah, Chris, you said before, China and the United States need each other. That's an economic issue. Is that enough to overcome all the political and cultural issues? Or do
Well,
they need more?
well, I don't think I think just purely economics is not a great bond. Like it's like one bar of cell service between cell phone and cell tower.
Yeah.
Like, you don't want to have that. It's probably why I've been going out on the internet here. So you want to have at least two. And I look at like Saudi Arabia, for instance. You know, there's a place where we have economic interests and we also have national security interests. So it sort of keeps that one going. But if one of those disappears, and obviously we're having national security issues with them, like then they're down to one bar, and that's a weird situation, right? So culturally, the good thing about China is there's 1.4 billion people there, and they do have lots of aspiration in regards to some of the things that Western culture, you know, permeates into their society. So I think as long as we have, you know, sports culture, music, you know, movies, television, even things like Nikes to GMs to things that have some sort of Western, you know, ingenuity involved with them, some sort of, you know, touch that brings something that's different than what they have there from the Western world, it creates a little more of a bond. But I don't want to be down to one bar of self-service, and I don't think anybody wants to. And I just don't believe friendships, by the way, that are just completely based on economics. There's a reason why you say, we're not really friends, we just do business together, right? Like that's not a great relationship. But you know, if your wives are hanging out, you play sports together, you know, go to concerts, you play golf, whatever it is, like then suddenly there's a stronger bond there, and you actually call the person a friend rather than, oh, that's just a business relationship.
So there's nothing personal, it's just business, doesn't make it.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm seeing a couple waves. Hey, thank you so much. By the way, and I'm happy to answer some more questions, but thank you everybody who's got to jump off for listening. I hope I addressed a lot of stuff. Like I said, if I did, please go out and pre-order the book, and please continue supporting this amazing library. And I really appreciate you taking time out of your Saturday.
Chris, one question. I was spent 4 years, we were trying to build a power plant in China. One thing I noticed a difference is that the people we are in Shanghai, in the outside the Beijing area, they don't like to talk about the politics. When they do business, they say, you want to talk about the central government, you go to Beijing. They kind of isolate themselves from the Beijing regime, you know, about all the rules and regulations. They are interested in that time is doing business with Americans. So did you see that difference? Although it's the same country.
Well, I think there's definitely a reluctance to bring politics into any. Look, the Chinese are smart. The Chinese are smart enough to know that politically they're not going to win us over on their form of government. They just know that. Like we, for some reason, believe that they're going to become a democracy someday. Which, by the way, I'd love to believe that's possible. I just don't think that should be an agenda item of ours. I've been on Steve Bannon's show, and I've talked to him off the show several times, and we disagree on that one. He thinks that eventually we can win over the Chinese people, they'll overthrow the CCP and become a democracy. I've told him that I think personally that the Chinese people like their government. You know, for the most part, they know they have certain freedoms that they don't have and could have in other forms of government, but they're willing to let those go because this government has provided them certain things that make them happy. I mean, think about it. The country did bring 400 million people into the middle class over the last couple decades. That's an amazing amount of people. I'm not saying I like that form of government, but there are a lot of people there that do believe in it. And I don't think our goal should be to try to get them to overthrow the CCP. If that happens, they're going to just do it themselves, and something's going to catalyze that. But that shouldn't be our objective as the U.S.
I think China has been always in the war. If you read all the history, and every time there is a war, a lot of people suffer. Meaning regular people suffer. And my family is afraid of a communist. That's why we left. And I think everybody say how bad a communist is. And one day someone brought to my attention, they say communists, they lost, basically everybody is very poor, put in the labor. One thing is that they really, really, like you said, bring a lot of people from poverty to at least they have food. Not too much, but nobody, basically hungry to death. You don't see that. So it's more like everybody's more equal. I think in that sense, probably is a big change. Of course, the people who have money got suffered of the landlord, everything, because all the land become the common people. So you look at that side, of course, the Democratic country, it's not going to happen like that because we have so much rich and poor difference. Of course, right now it's changing.
Look, I'm a patriot of the United States. I love the United States.
Me too, because that's why we are here.
I mean, but when I'm over there and I hear them pitch their party line, and you hear it a lot, and especially when you bring congressional members over there, you go from one, state official, office to another, and they all say the same thing. And there is a lot of truth to how it's worked for 1.4 billion people. Right. They have a lot of problems there also. What we do here, it's just one of those agree to disagree situations. Right. And I think we just, we need to focus on the stuff that actually that can actually make us more prosperous and healthier as the country here in the United States. And China can be something that really helps us get to a better state of welfare as long as we're smart and strategic about it.
Thank you so much for your talk.
You said you thought there was a positive role that the U.S. government could play in supporting our companies and insisting on certain fair practices. Do you see any movement in the U.S. government or a banding together of U.S. companies to insist on that would sort of bring our government into the picture as the Chinese government is already?
Yeah, it's good. It will happen through example. I actually would like to believe that, like the NBA situation, what happened there could have been one of those catalysts to get the nation to say, hey, this is a country to country issue. This is not one particular business in one particular industry's problem. Stop picking on the NBA. Let them do what they're doing. They have the right to do this. This is why we're going to put pressure on you to not retaliate. The problem with the NBA, as we know, is there were politics involved. The NBA has been very critical of our executive branch, and there was a lot of hypocrisy just in general by the silence that they had towards Hong Kong and all that kind of stuff. So that wasn't a great opportunity, I think, politically for it to be the catalyst. But I think if it was, like a Halliburton or something like that. But I'm just saying, like, if it was a more clear cut, just, hey, this is a boring company and a boring industry that just got unfairly retaliated against for something that shouldn't have been because it's not in the PRC's jurisdiction to do so. I think that kind of example is going to occur, and that will be the catalyst, hopefully, for the country to come in and defend it. Like, I wonder about Top Gun and Paramount, right? Paramount saying, you know what, we're not going to blur out those flags. We're not going to take it off the jacket. And then China retaliates. Politically, is there a willpower to defend a Hollywood studio, from that? Unfortunately, I think politics get in the way again.
Well, it's all
You
a
don't see Amazon and HP and Paramount and GM coming together and saying, hey, they're taking us off individually. We have to get a common policy towards China. That's not happening.
It's not happening, and it does need to happen. And part of that, I think, is, there's so much investor pressure, shareholder pressure to just stay quiet, do what you can to get in that market, keep it, it's money and pressure, lots of pressure from investors and shareholders. No one wants to be the only company that's trying to do it right. But if there's a collaborative effort, and by the way, if we reset this relationship, it is going to be disruptive in the short term, but it will be way more healthy for the country in the long term. The problem is shareholders are incentivized on quarterlies. Government officials have 2 to 4 year election cycles. Like, it's very hard to play the long game like China does, and they know that.
the whole WTO issue is. The current administration is using the WTO to really, as a fulcrum against China's policy and, well, intellectual property specifically.
Well, remember, we haven't pressured the WTO to designate China as a developed country, right? Like they're still playing in lopsided rules and a lopsided, playing field right now because they're still designated as a developing country.
Well, that's why he wants to get out.
Yeah, we gotta get them designated as developed, and we need to fix that to create a better level playing field. And by the way, another issue that's coming up is why do their accounting standards not have to adhere to publicly traded companies that are on the U.S. exchanges, right? I mean, that is ridiculous also. But the problem is, and I see some people with the money. There's so much money to make on Wall Street by allowing these Chinese companies to list publicly on our exchanges. The lobbying effort to keep it the way it is so strong. It's hard to create a level playing field, right? But it's crazy to me that everybody's going, oh, I can't believe Luckin Coffee was scamming all these investors and how many people got crushed in that stock. Well, it's because we don't force them to have the accounting standards that our U.S. companies have that are trading on the exchanges. So it's our own fault that happened, and it's going to happen again and again and again until we change that. But until companies that are making all this money off of that lopsided playing field decide to play ball and stop lobbying our leaders against it, then we're not going to fix it. And I'm not saying those people are wrong. Like, I was in the middle of creating a lot of these problems myself. So I get it. You're in the fog of war. You're not looking at how you're screwing up the country and your own little cog in the wheel when you're doing it. But when you step back from it, like I have, and somebody like Daryl Morey tweets something and it makes you go, oh, why didn't I realize that? Well, those people probably haven't had that realization moment yet. I'm sure there's some greedy people doing it that know, but then there's probably a lot of people that are just not even thinking about it. It's just what they do in a day-to-day business.
Well, Chinese is a big market. I was surprised how many McDonald's over there, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Starbucks just had a lot of coffee shops there, and they are doing very well because of the tremendous population. And probably that's another reason. That's why they put up with some of the regulations or the, it's mainly marketing, money.
Very much so. Very much so.
All right. On my end, it's time for me to say goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chris, on behalf of the James Blackstone for visiting us from California.
Yeah, I really appreciate everybody sitting through this on a Saturday. I hope it was engaging and entertaining. You learned something, and
Oh, I got a lot out of it.
great. And then, yeah, feel free to get on my Twitter or Instagram or whatever. And if you have other questions, I'll try to address them. I have another op-ed coming out this week and a lot of fun appearances. So, you know, hopefully you enjoy the book when it comes out July 28th. And thank you again. Totally honored.
Thank you. I just found out I know your mother. We were in the meeting together and then we were talking about your program. And suddenly she was telling me, I said, how did you know him so much? And he said, he's my son.
Well, Helen, nice to meet you. Tsai Jen. Have a good day.
再见，谢谢。
Hey, thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Jenna.
Yep.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Chris.
Nice to meet you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye, Mom and Dad.
Yeah.
Per gay, Nick, Jeff.
Yeah,
Bye, guys.
everybody.
Take care.
It was
Thank you.
good, Chris.
Thanks.
Oh, Patty Hill.
Yes, Patty Hill.
Thank
Hey,
you
Patty
so
Hill.
much.
Hill.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You have a very talented, smart son.
So long, Barb. So long, Tones.
What you would say.
See you next week.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.